1979, Ayatollah Khomeini took control of Iran as the Shah's government collapsed.
The Ayatollah Khomeini.
Very soon we will announce a new government, probably a few days.
Within days, people were pulled off the streets, rushed through short trials, and executed within hours. Some were shot in schoolyards. Others were hanged in public. But that was only the beginning.
The number killed in Tehran since the beginning of the month is probably well over 100. But people in this crowd were saying and believing 7,000 had been killed.
The methods kept changing, becoming faster, harsher, and far more hidden, until prisoners began disappearing behind prison walls, with no bodies, no graves, and no answers. How the killing started. The killing started almost as soon as the old order fell apart. On January 16, 1979, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran.
The Shah and his Empress left shortly before midday.
On February 1, Ayatollah Khomeini came back after about 14 years in exile. Tehran was already boiling by then. Ministers were stepping down. Army units were confused. Huge crowds were still filling the streets. Then, on February 11, the armed forces declared neutrality, pulled back, and the monarchy was finished. The new Islamic Republic had not even been formally approved by a national vote yet, but real power was already moving into Khomeini's hands. One place sat right at the center of all of it: Rifa School in Tehran. It was a girls' school, but for those first days of the revolution, it became far more than that. It became Khomeini's headquarters. Crowds packed the streets around it. Reporters waited outside it. Orders were given inside it. Men were brought there as prisoners. It was the kind of place where politics, fear, anger, and power all got squeezed into the same building. That matters because the killing machine did not start later, after everything had settled down. It started right there, inside the same place where the new rulers were building their power. That speed is what made the first week so shocking. The country had not yet held the late March vote that approved an Islamic Republic, and it would not be until April 1st that Khomeini declared the new order in full. But before that new state was even firmly set, people were already being arrested, judged, and shot. Punishment was not some later mistake or side effect. It was part of the rise itself. The message was clear from the start. This revolution was not just going to remove the Shah. It was going to destroy the people tied to him, fast and in public. To do that, the new rulers used special courts built for speed, not fairness. These were the revolutionary courts. In plain terms, they were made to punish the enemies of the revolution as quickly as possible. They began operating right after the February takeover, and on June 17, 1979, they were formally set up by official order. Even that order showed what kind of justice this was supposed to be. Khomeini said trials should not last more than 2 days, and said the accused were already convicted. That tells you almost everything. These courts were not built to ask whether a person was guilty. They were built to turn guilt into death as fast as possible. The charges used in those courts were broad enough to cover almost anyone the new rulers wanted to crush. One was Muhareba, which meant war against God. Another was Efsad fil arts, which meant corruption on earth. Those words sounded huge, holy, and final. In practice, they were loose enough to swallow almost anything. A person could be accused of helping the Shah, holding office under him, backing repression, or just being part of the old system, and that could be enough. Amnesty found that legal safeguards were missing. Lawyers were not properly available. Trials were often held in secret. And executions could happen with almost no real chance to challenge anything. That is why the killings moved so quickly. The courts were built to clear the path to the firing squad, not to slow it down. That path led straight to the first big scene at Rifa School.
Ayatollah Khomeini had just dispatched one of his clerics, Sadegh Khalkhali, to the region to oversee the execution of anyone deemed against the revolution, and among those people were Kurds.
On the night of February 15, 1979, 4 major men from the Shah's old order were put forward as the first headline executions of the new era. They were Ni'matollah Nasiri, the former head of Savak, which was the Shah's feared secret police. Mehdi Rahimi had been Tehran's military governor and police chief during the final unrest. Reza Naji had been the military governor of Isfahan. Manucher Khosrodad had commanded army aviation and was one of the best-known officers in the old military. These were not low-level men. They were chosen because their deaths would say something loud. The new rulers were showing the whole country who could be dragged in next. The setting made it even darker. A school classroom became a courtroom. A school roof became an execution ground. Reports from the Times say the trial began that morning and ran until the evening. There were only a few people in the room. The atmosphere was full of anger. One journalist who was there later said the men barely had a chance to speak and were insulted through much of the hearing. Amnesty's early findings on these courts matched that picture. No proper defense, no real time to prepare, and no meaningful appeal once a death sentence was handed down. By about 1:45, the 4 generals were shot. It all happened in less than a day. These first killings were not hidden away in shame. That is one of the most important things to understand. Khomeini personally approved the sentences. Photographs were taken. Footage was recorded. The public was meant to see that the old order was not just defeated but physically destroyed. The shots were part punishment, part warning, and part theater. Anyone still tied to the Shah or suspected of standing in the way could now see what the new balance of power looked like. Sadegh Khalkhali became one of the faces of that early terror. He later boasted that the first people he tried were Nasiri, Khosrodad, Naji, and Rahimi, and he called them the first executions. He also said he had condemned more people that same night and wanted them killed too. Khalkhali believed that many senior men tied to the Shah after 1963 were already worthy of death, and once those first 4 were dead, the circle widened fast. The roof of Rafah did not stay a one-night symbol. The same kind of summary process spread to more former officials, police figures, military men, and people accused of serving the old order. Records later counted at least 763 arbitrary and extrajudicial executions in 1979 alone. By the summer of 1979, the shootings were no longer aimed only at the Shah's top men in Tehran. Now the new state was carrying the same method into the provinces. The clearest early example came in the Kurdish regions in the west. Many Iranian Kurds had supported the revolution, but they also wanted more self-rule and more control over their own affairs. The new leadership saw that as a threat. In August, Khomeini ordered a military move against Kurdish areas. Khalkhali was sent there too. He moved through towns like Pave, Marivan, Sanandaj, Saqqez, and Mahabad, where summary trials and executions followed. At that point, the firing squad was no longer just a way to punish the fallen men of the Shah. It was becoming a tool for crushing fresh resistance inside the new Iran. One of the clearest scenes from that campaign happened at Sanandaj Airport on August 27, 1979. Prisoners were tried in a makeshift setting at the airport. The hearing was brutally short. Then the condemned men were taken outside, blindfolded, lined up, and shot by firing squad. A photographer named Jahangir Razmi captured the moment. His picture from Sanandaj later won the Pulitzer Prize in 1980 and became one of the best-known images of the new regime's early killings. The world could now see what had happened in a single frame: blindfolds, rifles, dust, and men seconds from death. That image mattered for another reason too. It showed that the killings were visible far beyond Iran. The United Nations Subcommission on Human Rights condemned those Kurdish executions. Iranian newspapers had already been carrying reports of Khalkhali's brutality, and now the rest of the world had a picture to match the warnings. By the end of that first phase, the new regime had found its first clear language of power. A short trial, a quick sentence, a firing squad, and public proof that it happened. Once the new regime proved it could shoot its enemies, it moved toward a method that could haunt prisons, dominate city squares, and hang over daily life. When the noose became normal. By the end of 1979, the new rulers were no longer acting like men caught in the heat of a revolution. They were building a state that could punish, jail, and kill in a steady way. In October, a new constitution was approved. In early December, it took effect, and Khomeini became the supreme leader. The violence changed with that shift. In the first months, the executions looked like raw revenge. Now they were becoming part of how the country was run. The courts were already working. The guards were already armed. The prisons were already filling up. Then on September 22, 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. The country was now at war, and that made the rulers even more suspicious of anyone they saw as a threat at home. The killings were no longer just the anger of victory. They were becoming state routine. That change showed up fast in politics. Abul Hassan Banisadr, Iran's first president, had once stood close to Khomeini, but the bond broke down. Banisadr attacked the growing power of the Islamic Republican Party and warned that the revolution was sliding toward dictatorship. On June 7, 1981, his newspaper was shut down. Days later, Khomeini stripped him of his role as commander-in-chief. Then came June 20th and 21st, when lawmakers moved to impeach him. By then, the pressure was already boiling over in the streets. His fall mattered because it broke one of the last major figures who still stood between the hardline clerics and full control. Once Banisadr was pushed out, the regime no longer had to pretend it was making room for different voices inside the revolution. On June 20th, the fight moved out into the open. Huge protests broke out in Tehran and other cities after the call went out from the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, often shortened to the MEK, a powerful opposition group that had once fought the Shah and now stood against the new rulers. State radio kept warning people not to join. Clerics declared that demonstrators, no matter their age, would be treated as enemies of God. Armed forces blocked streets, opened fire, and turned the protest into a bloodbath. Reports put the number killed above 50, with more than 200 wounded. Around Tehran University alone, about 1,000 people were arrested. The next day, the poet and playwright Saeed Soltanpour was among 15 leftist opponents who were executed after almost no real process at all. The message was brutal and simple. Street protest could now lead straight to death. 8 days later, the violence jumped again. On June 28th, a bomb exploded at the headquarters of the Islamic Republic Party and killed 73 officials, including Chief Justice Mohammad Beheshti, 4 cabinet ministers, and 27 members of parliament. The regime blamed the MEK and answered with a far wider campaign of arrests and executions. This was the moment when the target changed in a major way. In the first phase after the revolution, the state had mostly hunted men tied to the Shah. Now it was hunting the revolution's own younger enemies: students, writers, activists, leftists, and anyone accused of backing the wrong side. The killings were no longer aimed only at the old order. They were now aimed at the people who had helped bring the revolution into being and then refused to kneel to it. The net spread far beyond bombs and guns. Many of the people swept up in that crackdown had not carried out attacks at all. Some were taken because they were believed to support the MEK. Some were caught with pamphlets, leaflets, or newspapers. Some had taken part in demonstrations. Some had collected money for the families of prisoners. Some were seized just for being linked to politically active friends or relatives. Between June 1981 and March 1982, thousands of opponents, including hundreds of children, were arbitrarily detained and then subjected to disappearance, torture, and summary or extrajudicial execution. What had started as a revolution against one ruling class was now devouring large parts of its own children. That change was felt most clearly inside the prisons. Families across Iran began to live in fear of certain places, and one of the darkest was Evin Prison in Tehran. Evin had become the place where the court system and the prison system fed each other. A person could be arrested in the street, beaten in custody, dragged before a judge, and then disappear behind prison walls. The same court culture from the first phase was still there. Quick hearings, weak evidence, almost no real defense, and no meaningful chance to appeal. But now the machine was bigger and more settled. It had prosecutors, wardens, guards, interrogation rooms, holding cells, and execution grounds. The scale in 1981 was staggering. Amnesty recorded 2,616 executions in that year that it could identify, and 2,444 of them came after June 20th. Amnesty also stressed that its record was far from complete and likely far below the real total. The United Nations report released in 2024 reached the same broad picture. It described the killings from June 1981 to March 1982 as part of a widespread and systematic attack, with the number of known victims rising into the thousands. In the 6 weeks after the June 28th bombing alone, more than 1,000 people were sent to firing squads, and in the next 9 weeks, another 1,200 were killed. By early November, the total had reached at least 2,668. This was no longer a burst of violence. It was mass killing at speed. The most chilling part was how young many of the victims were. Reports from the time described teenagers being arrested, tortured, and executed. Amnesty received many reports of juveniles killed in 1981 and 1982, some as young as 11. Later, United Nations findings put the number at least 175 children executed across Iran between June 1981 and March 1982. That is a minimum count, and the records clearly include children as young as 13, 14, 15, and 16.
Iran has sharply stepped up its use of public executions, according to Amnesty International. More than a dozen men, including juveniles, have been hanged in public since the start of the year.
Some of these young people had been picked up over low-level political activity. Some were seized because they were linked to wanted relatives. At first, many of the killings in that 1981 wave were still done by firing squad. But as the prison system settled into the rhythm of repeated death sentences, hanging kept growing as one of the regime's main tools. It fit the logic of the new state. It was simple. It was cheap. It could be repeated again and again. Iran's penal code allowed judicial execution by hanging, firing squad, or stoning. Executions could take place in public, with the body left on view afterward. That detail tells you a lot. A killing was no longer only an endpoint for one prisoner. It was part of a wider lesson for everyone else. The state wanted death to be seen, remembered, and feared. That is how the noose became normal. A body on display told people what disobedience looked like at the end. It told families what the state could do. It told young activists what would happen if they kept going. Even after the worst wave of killings in 1981 slowed down, the system did not go away. Amnesty recorded 470 executions in 1985 and believed the real number was higher. That lower number still meant the death machine was alive and steady. Judges were still handing down death sentences. Courts were still operating with little real protection for the accused. Prisons were still central to the system. By then, people in Iran had been living for years with the knowledge that an accusation could turn into execution with terrible speed. The shock from the first years had hardened into everyday fear. That was one of the regime's biggest victories. It did not need chaos anymore. It had taught people what the state was willing to do. The machinery also began reaching further beyond organized political opposition. Even before the late 1980s, executions were already being reported for charges like espionage, support for Kurdish groups, robbery, and drug smuggling. In April 1983, mobile anti-narcotic courts were reportedly being set up to deal with drug cases on the spot. The Chief Justice at the time was quoted as saying the courts were meant to punish obvious offenders right there. He also treated many drug smugglers as people corrupted beyond saving and deserving death. The death penalty was becoming a wider tool of control. Then, on May 29, 1988, the Expediency Council approved the first anti-narcotics law. That was a major step because it gave clear legal backing to a harsh security approach that had already been building for years. The law laid out punishments, fines, and state measures for drug cases, but it did not soften the basic spirit of the system. It helped lock that spirit in. Drug cases, like political cases, stayed under revolutionary courts, where review was weak, and death sentences could come fast. By the late 1980s, people in Iran had lived for years under a state that could kill in more than one way and for more than one reason. By now, public terror had done its work. After years of teaching fear in public, the regime moved to its most efficient method of all: killing in secret, inside walls almost nobody could enter. The Summer of Hidden Hangings. By the summer of 1988, Iran was worn out. The war with Iraq had dragged on for almost 8 years. Whole cities had been hit. Families had buried sons for years. Then, on July 18th, Iran accepted United Nations Security Council Resolution 598, which meant it was finally moving toward a ceasefire. For many people, that should have been the moment the killing slowed down. Instead, a new killing phase was about to begin behind prison walls. Just 1 week later, on July 25th, the MEK launched a cross-border attack from Iraq into Iran. The attack failed. But inside the prisons, it gave the rulers exactly what they needed: an excuse. The later evidence points to something even darker than a furious reaction. It points to a plan that was already being set in place before the attack even happened. Prisoners had already started to feel something changing before the fatwa, a religious order, was issued. Survivors later said prison officials had been sorting people, moving them, threatening them, and testing how steadfast they were long before the killing wave fully opened. In some prisons, visits were cut off, wards were separated, and men were questioned in ways that did not make sense at the time. Some thought they were being moved. Some thought a pardon might be coming. Some thought nothing at all because prison life had already trained them to expect sudden cruelty. But the pattern that later came out was hard to ignore. There were signs of planning, signs of sorting, and signs that the state was deciding who would live and who would die before it ever admitted anything to the outside world. Then came Khomeini's order. Around July 28th, he issued a secret fatwa ordering the execution of prisoners who remained steadfast in support of the MEK. That word mattered. It did not mean a new crime had been proven. It meant the state believed a prisoner had not broken, had not bent, had not fully submitted. The fatwa called these prisoners enemies of God and pushed officials to act with what it called revolutionary rage. That is what made this phase so chilling. Many of the people marked for death were already in prison. They had already been sentenced years earlier. Many were not on death row. Some had almost finished their time. Some had already finished it and were still being held. The state did not need new crimes. It only needed a new order saying the old prisoners could now be killed. To carry that out, special panels were formed inside prisons across the country. Survivors later called them death commissions. In Tehran, the most important names were Hossein Ali Nayeri, Morteza Eshraghi, Mostafa Pourmohammadi, and Ibrahim Raisi. Nayeri was the religious judge. Eshraghi was the Tehran prosecutor. Pourmohammadi represented the intelligence side. Raisi, then a deputy prosecutor, also sat in the room and took part in the process. These men were not there to hold real trials. They were there to sort the condemned from the spared. The room might look like an official hearing, but it was really a killing checkpoint. A person walked in alive and could walk out marked for death in just a few minutes. The questions they asked were simple, but they were built like traps. Would you denounce the MEK? Would you repent? Would you declare loyalty to the Islamic Republic? Would you walk through a minefield for the army? Would you fight for the state? Would you spy on old friends? Would you stand in a firing squad? Would you hang another prisoner? These were not questions meant to uncover the truth. They were pressure tools. A wrong answer could kill you. Sometimes even a seemingly safe answer was not enough. Some prisoners agreed to denounce the MEK and still ended up selected for execution. That is what made the room so terrifying. Life and death were hanging on a few words, in front of men who were not looking for fairness in the first place. The horror was made even worse by how little prisoners understood about what was happening around them. Authorities suspended visits. They removed televisions. They cut people off from the yard. In some places, doors and windows were even welded shut. Prisoners were moved in groups, blindfolded, and made to wait in hallways. Names were called one by one. Men disappeared and did not come back. Because the state had already isolated the wards, many prisoners could only guess at the scale of what was happening. They heard doors. They heard boots. They heard guards rushing. They heard silence where voices used to be. That silence was part of the method. It kept the condemned confused, and it kept the survivors from seeing the full size of the operation until it was far too late. Inside Evan and Gohardasht, the first big wave seems to have hit between July 26th and July 30th. Survivor accounts describe men waiting blindfolded in corridors, being taken toward rooms or halls where ropes were already ready. One account described chairs standing under hanging ropes. Another described bodies already on the floor. In some cases, guards hurried the process along, dragging in the next batch before the last one was even fully dealt with.
After a while, I sensed that a guard was pouring some water on me. When I opened my eyes, I saw that the bodies were lingering on the ropes.
One prisoner with epilepsy reportedly had to be carried to the gallows because he could not walk there on his own. The killing did not stop with Emek prisoners. It soon spread further. Reports say the massacre happened in two main waves. The first wave focused on MEK prisoners. Then the net widened to leftist prisoners and others the regime hated, including people whose beliefs had nothing to do with the armed attack from Iraq. No one knows the final death toll with complete certainty, and that uncertainty is part of the crime. A careful estimate places the number between about 2,800 and 5,000 prisoners killed in at least 32 cities. Another major body of research cross-checked lists containing 4,672 names and treated that as a minimum documented count, not a final total. The safest way to understand it is this. The number was in the thousands, spread across the country, and large enough that the truth could not be hidden forever, even though the state tried to do exactly that. Then came another layer of cruelty. Families were usually not warned before the executions. For weeks and months, many were kept in total darkness. When prison visits resumed in late October and early November, officials began telling some families verbally that their relatives had been executed. But even then, they often gave no written notice, no clear date, no real explanation, and no body. Many families were summoned to a prison or government office, handed a bag that supposedly held the dead person's belongings, and ordered not to hold a memorial ceremony. Some families were not even given that much. Some were sent from office to office and told nobody knew anything. Some heard the truth only from released prisoners. In some cases, families waited months or years before learning that their loved one was never coming back. The bodies were hidden almost as carefully as the killings themselves. In many cases, officials refused to say where people were buried. Kavaran, in the southeast of Tehran, became the best-known burial ground linked to the massacre. But it was only one part of a larger pattern. Families in other places also found themselves chasing rumors from guards, cemetery workers, and locals just to guess where the dead might be. In at least some places, families confirmed mass graves by digging and finding body parts, yet the authorities still refused to admit that these mass graves existed. It also wanted to break the final bond between the dead and the people still looking for them, and even that was not the end. Over the years, suspected and confirmed grave sites were watched, blocked, damaged, and in some cases bulldozed or covered over. Families were stopped from gathering. Flowers and pictures were not allowed. Memorial signs were torn down. Some sites were hidden under concrete, roads, or new burial plots. Kavaran itself became a place where families tried to remember, and the state kept trying to erase. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.